Good day. I've been expecting previously, in my previous programme, that would be the last programme I would do on the Australian nuclear submarine deal and on this new AUKUS arrangement that Britain, the United States and Australia have announced between them. However, over the last few hours, events have moved forward and it's becoming increasingly clear, at least to me, and I'm sure, by the way, to many other officials and diplomats around the world, that the AUKUS announcement and, above all, the nuclear submarine deal was, at least from the perspective of the United States, an own goal, a horrible own goal, mismanaged and miscalculated, with repercussions which are turning out badly for the United States. And we see that the United States is now trying, to the best extent that it can, to mend fences with its various allies and friends to try to explain away AUKUS and the nuclear submarine deal, and in the case of France, even to apologise for what has happened. Now, I talk about an apology. We now have a joint statement published by the US and French governments following a discussion between President Macron of France and President Biden of the United States, in which we've now get a clear sense of the United States apologising to France for the whole AUKUS arrangement and the way it was done, and the way in which the United States acted, in effect, to torpedo the nuclear submarine deal. And the wording of the statement, which has clearly been extremely carefully drafted, is extremely interesting, so I'm going to read it out in full. As always, I take it from the White House website, and it reads as follows. President Emmanuel Macron of the French Republic and President Joe Biden of the United States of America spoke on September 22nd at the request of the latter in order to discuss the implications of the announcement on September 15th. Now, let's just first unpack that first statement. Notice that, very remarkably, Macron's name is placed first ahead of President Biden's, giving France in this conversation precedence over the United States. And notice also that we are told that the conversation took place at the request of President Biden. Now, I've discussed in several programs that I've done on this channel the importance in terms of diplomatic protocol when a statement or a readout of a conversation published by foreign ministries, or in this case, the heads of government, the White House in this case, specify who it was who initiated a call. The reason is that if a call is warm and friendly, the two governments that participated in the call wanted to appear that the two parties are fully equal with each other and that this was a friendly and consensual call. When a readout specifies which party initiated the call, then it is either an attempt by the government that has published the readout to confirm that the other country is the supplicant that initiated the call and that the country at the receiving end of the call is the grantor in the stronger position, or alternatively, as in this case, it is a form of apology. And note, this is an American readout, and it tells us that President Biden asked to speak to Macron of France, and that the French are given precedence. Their concerns are given precedence in this statement. In other words, it was the President of the United States who admits in this readout that he acted as a supplicant to the French, and that already gives this statement a tone of apology. Anyway, It goes on to say the following. The two leaders agreed that the situation would have benefited from open discussions among allies on matters of strategic interest to France and our European partners. President Biden conveyed his ongoing commitment in that regard. Now, that just stops short of an apology, but it is a confession of American wrongdoing. That is extremely unusual to see, to put it mildly, in statements signed off by the President of the United States and by the White House. And I'm going to add something else. I've made repeated points in several commentaries that I've made in several programs that I've made for this channel, that much of the harm about the AUKUS announcement and indeed the nuclear submarine deal would have been avoided if the discussions on the submarine announcement and the AUKUS deal had been conducted openly and transparently, and if all the relevant parties, including of course France, but also the other Indo-Pacific nations, had been openly informed and consulted about what was going on, instead of having this extraordinary news sprung on them, so that in the case of the French and the others, they learnt about it from the media. Now, here we see no less a person than the President of the United States agreeing belatedly that that was the case. The United States now admits that this secret negotiation, which took place between Australia, Britain and France, was a mistake, that it has weakened alliances, caused problems between the United States and its major allies, and he is now taking, in effect, the step of telephoning the French president, saying mea culpa, apologizing in effect for what happened, and giving the French and others promises, assurances that this kind of secret diplomacy at their expense will never happen again. Anyway, to continue, the two leaders have decided to open a process of in-depth consultations aimed at creating the conditions for ensuring confidence and proposing concrete measures towards common objectives. They will meet in Europe at the end of October in order to reach shared understandings and maintain momentum in this process. So there's now going to be detailed ongoing discussions between the French and the Americans, and note that the President of the United States is going to travel to Europe at the end of October to meet with the French President. Usually the expectation is that it will be the foreign government that will travel to the, if you like, imperial capital, Washington, to meet with the US president there. I say that, obviously the exception is when the United States president, is on a foreign tour. But usually, as I said, it is the foreign leader who travels to Washington to meet with the president. This time, things are so bad, the Americans feel themselves to be at such a point of disadvantage. They're so obviously worried about damage to NATO, about damage to the alliances, this prospect or talk about a European army, which I discussed in my previous program, that the President of the United States has had to tell the President of France that he will meet the President of France somewhere in Europe in October. In other words, the US President is going to travel to Europe to speak to the French President. Now, it doesn't say that he will travel to France. It doesn't say that he will go to Paris. I think that might be a humiliation, too far, and we are talking about what is to all intents and purposes a humiliation, but a reasonable guess is that this will happen in Brussels in October, probably in the context of a general NATO meeting. And we see and read that in response to these words of, in effect, apology and conciliation, and these promises of further consultations and discussions down the line to address French concerns and French interests, that President Macron has decided to take the following step. And again, I go from the readout. President Emmanuel Macron has decided that the French ambassador will return to Washington next week. He will then start intensive work with senior US officials. So there's now going to be a tough negotiation between the French and the Americans, and quite possibly we will see France joining AUKUS, at least in some form, but perhaps even conceivably participating in the nuclear submarine deal, though I think that might be extremely difficult. And we will see that the French, at least, are making demands of the United States, and the United States, wrong-footed by this affair, is now going to be obliged in some way to try to meet French concerns, and we will see how far the United States is prepared to go. But we get a sense of what might be coming from the next paragraph. President Biden reaffirms the strategic importance of French and European engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, including in the framework of the European Union's recently published strategy for the Indo-Pacific. The United States also recognizes the importance of a stronger and more capable European defense that contributes positively to transatlantic and global security and is complementary to NATO. So let's unpack that. He recognizes that the French have interests in the Indo-Pacific region. We can disregard the European Union for that purpose. He recognizes that France, unlike Britain, by the way, has territories, overseas territories in the Pacific, and is itself a Pacific power. And he acknowledges and accepts that the French may indeed, therefore, have strategic interests in the Pacific, which the United States up to now has disregarded, and it may be that the United States will try to find some way, therefore, of accommodating France by addressing its concerns and looking for ways to reaffirm US military and strategic partnership with France in the Pacific. I come back to what I said. I think it's possible, I think it's highly likely, in fact, that we will see France joining AUKUS in some form. But the other sentence is even more interesting, and it says the following, and I'm going to read it again. The United States also recognizes the importance of a stronger and more capable European defense that contributes positively to transatlantic and global security and is complementary to NATO. Now, I cannot see that as anything other than a green light, an endorsement, if you like, of Macron's policy for an EU army. We're talking here about the importance of a stronger and more capable European defense, and we learn that it is going to be complementary to NATO. So it is a European defense, it's not a NATO defense, and it's going to be complementary to NATO. It looks as if the French have managed to leverage this row to get at least some pallid endorsement from the United States for their project to set up a European army. Whether that's going to be enough to overcome German and East European hostility to this idea is another matter, but Macron can pocket this and come along and say that he now has, for this project, the support of none other than the President of the United States. And then we read the last paragraph is the usual rounding off paragraph. In the framework of their joint fight against terrorism, the United States commits to reinforcing its support to counter-terrorism operations in the Sahel conducted by European states. In other words, France, because it's the French who are, of course, really leading the fight in the Sahel states. So another acknowledgement by the United States in this statement of the important role that France plays in Western security cooperation. So this is quite a joint statement. The Americans are in effect, well, not in effect, they are straightforwardly admitting that they were entirely in the wrong to negotiate this nuclear submarine deal with the Australians and the British in secret. They accept and admit that they should have consulted France and informed France of what was going on. They admit also that this is not behaviour compatible with the actions of an ally. These are quite extraordinary admissions. As I said, the statement doesn't use the word apology, but that is in effect what we are seeing here. And the United States is now going to enter into intensive discussions with the French about giving the French some role in US strategy in the Indo-Pacific, quite possibly inviting France to join this AUKUS arrangement. And the United States has also given a green light, or at least an amber light, for the French proposals to set up a European army. I think that this is an abject statement, one in which the United States is making more concessions to an ally than I have ever seen in my time. And I have to say that it is perhaps an indication of the extent to which the Americans now realize that they were wrong-footed, that they made a whole succession of mistakes with this affair, and that they have to act fast and make big and substantive concessions in order to repair the damage which has been done. Now, contrast all of that with the meetings between Biden and Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison, which have taken place in New York over the course of the UN General Assembly meeting there. Now, the White House has provided extensive readouts of these meetings, and I'm not going to read them out because they're firstly quite long, but one thing immediately stood out for me. None of these readouts, none of these statements, not one of them refers to AUKUS or to the nuclear submarine deal. It's as if the United States is now deeply embarrassed about this affair, and we see that the United States is getting extremely, obviously, trying to distance itself from the implications of this affair. And it's very striking that in the discussions with Morrison, Biden talks about NATO, the EU, the cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. There's talk about old alliances and the fact that there's an admission that the US-Australia alliance dates back 70 years. And there's also some talk about the Quad. But there is no actual discussion of the nuclear submarine deal, none at all about the fact that there's going to be a new arrangement, AUKUS, to supplement the ANZUS alliance and all the other alliances that the United States already has with Australia. And that's the case both in the discussions that Biden had with Morrison, and it's also the case in the discussions that Biden had with Boris Johnson. And there's something else about Boris Johnson, because, of course, what we learn from the readout, from the various transcripts of the of the discussions, is that the British came along once more trying to float this idea of a free trade deal. And, of course, there's been absolutely nothing agreed about that. On the contrary, the United States seems to be holding out It's pushing back on the trade deal. It's giving the clear impression that the trade deal between the United States and Britain is not on the cards, at least not for the moment. And that is, again, something that is going to annoy and upset the British very considerably, and it's something that I think the British will be extremely uncomfortable with. And in fact, we are getting reports in the media that Biden basically told Johnson that a free trade deal between the United States and Britain is not on the agenda at the moment, but that on the contrary, he wants Britain to stick rigidly to the Northern Ireland Protocol that Britain agreed as part of its withdrawal agreement with the EU in connection with the Brexit discussions. So the conversations with Johnson, and by the way, Johnson didn't just meet Biden, he also met Kamala Harris, and there's readouts of those meetings as well. Those conversations seem to have been stiff and rather cold and resulted in nothing substantive, whereas the conversation with Macron resulted in what is, as I said, an abject apology to the French and significant concessions to the French about the Indo-Pacific region and France's role there, and on the topic of the EU army that the French are pushing. And the point perhaps also to say is that you might have expected that in the aftermath of the announcement of AUKUS and the nuclear submarine deal, there would be celebrations of that announcement in New York, but nothing of the sort happened. Biden, Johnson, and Morrison avoided all discussion of the issue. So already it's beginning to look like an unpleasant incident, something that has to be, people are trying to find some way of working round. And I would add, by the way, that it's not just France that is now upset by AUKUS. Other countries are, and perhaps the country that is causing the greatest concerns for the moment to the United States is India. And we're having some reports, increasing reports, that the Indians are increasingly unhappy about AUKUS. And one of the things that is now being, one of the comments that's been circulated in the Indian media is a comment made by a senior Biden administration official in Washington who briefed the media on September 15th and was asked whether there is scope in future for the US to extend similar cooperation to other countries as it has to Australia in connection with the nuclear submarine deal. And this is what that official said in response. And as I said, it is being circulated in India and discussed in India and elsewhere in the Pacific. This is what he said. I do want to underscore, we see this as a very rare engagement between Australia, Great Britain, and the United States. We've done this only once before. That was almost 70 years ago with Great Britain. This technology is extremely sensitive. This is, frankly, an exception to our policy in many respects. I do not anticipate that this will be undertaken in other circumstances going forward. We view this as a one-off. And what we now read, and this is a commentary made by M.S. Badrakumar, who is a former Indian diplomat who writes a most interesting blog, he says the following. Of course, neither Japan nor India hold such compelling geopolitical relevance for Australia, for Washington as Australia, which is the hub of America's Indo-Pacific strategy, with Indian Ocean to its west and Pacific Ocean to its east. Thus, it is equipping Australia with a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines of cutting-edge technology to patrol the Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific. Although Washington and Delhi may have common interests, they have significant differences as well. India will not completely turn to the US side like Australia. Washington and New Delhi have different political needs in the medium and long term. India would have its ambitions too. AUKUS is bound to be studied carefully in Tokyo and Delhi, and it will affect their strategic choices. Much is still in the dark about this enhanced trilateral security partnership between three maritime democracies. Will there be a governing treaty? No doubt the US will aim at building a more solid and broad foundation for its Indo-Pacific strategy, with the AUKUS and the Quad complementing each other. However, within the Quad framework, Australia stands out now as more equal than Japan and India in terms of US willingness to share super sensitive core technologies. Japan and India need to assimilate the psychological blow. And then he goes on to say that Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has made a phone call to his French counterpart. Jaishankar tweeted, discussed recent developments in the Indo-Pacific and Afghanistan with my friend, French Foreign Minister Le Drian, looking forward to our New York meeting. So the Indians feel that they have been put in an unequal position with respect to Australia in the Quad arrangement, and they don't like it. And it's not just Bandra Kumar who's saying this. Now, this article comes from Sputnik, but it is undoubtedly, I think, reflective of Indian opinions, and it contains the following comments. Sanjaya Baru, a former advisor to ex-Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, has told Sputnik that India has been already hedging its bets against future US unpredictability in the wake of the Americans' ignominious retreat from Afghanistan and the increased terror threat perception the decision created for New Delhi. Baru went on to underline the geopolitical activism of India of late, pointing out Prime Minister Narendra Modi's attendance at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization leaders meeting and the BRICS summit in recent weeks, as well as Indian Foreign Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar's bilateral meetings in recent months with his counterparts from China, Russia and Iran. India has finally come round to the view of the fast-changing world of the 21st century and is spreading its risks, the ex-PM aide said, whilst warning against the perils of putting all the eggs in one basket. Baru says that the view in the Indian foreign policy establishment that New Delhi should now enter into a full-fledged alliance with the United States amid the security and economic threat from China was ill-advised, adding that India will continue to have a mind of its own. And elsewhere in the article, we learn that the Indians also resent and are annoyed by the way in which this announcement of AUKUS and of the nuclear-powered submarine deal has in effect told the Indians that they are a less equal partner than the United States than Australia in the Quad arrangement, so far as the United States is concerned. So the Quad has been weakened. India is annoyed. Japan probably is also making its own assessments, and the French have been exasperated and infuriated, and they've extracted from the Americans a fulsome apology from the US president, a commitment from the US president to meet the French president in Europe in October, and an agreement from the Americans to greenlight the creation of the EU army that the French are so keen on pursuing. Well, this is a debacle, And can I just say straight away that the Americans will no doubt be able to patch things together with their allies. The country that's coming out worse from this is not Australia, which is far away. It's having problems now getting its EU-Australia trade deal passed through the European Council, because the French are out to punish the Australians for what they've done. And note that the French are not so far returning their ambassador to Canberra, even though they've agreed to return their ambassador to Washington. But the big loser so far, and I have to say this, is Britain. And I'm going to make now a guess about what has been going on, because I've been trying to work out AUKUS and this nuclear submarine deal and who initiated this whole idea and where it came from. And as people who've been following my programs know, I have for some time wondered whether Boris Johnson is the person who has initiated this shambles. And I think straightforwardly it was. Boris Johnson, throughout this year, has been acting in an increasingly restless and reckless way insofar as British foreign policy is concerned. He sent, as we know, a British frigate incredibly close to the Russian-controlled Crimea Peninsula in circumstances that put British lives at risk, and which the British Foreign Office and some people, I suspect, in the British military were not happy with. He came very close to doing much the same thing, sending the HMS Queen Elizabeth to the Pacific and sending her through the South China Sea with all sorts of wild talk that the HMS Queen Elizabeth, might do what the British frigate did in the Black Sea, which is sail close to Chinese-controlled islands and navy reefs. That idea, if it existed, which I suspect it did, was called off when the Americans made it clear that they weren't supportive, that in fact they didn't want the British getting into that kind of trouble, and they certainly didn't want American lives, there being American pilots and American aircraft on that carrier. They didn't want American lives put at risk, and they didn't want an incident between the United States and China, which might require the United States to come and extricate the British from whatever mess Johnson had landed them in. And then we had a whole cascade of complaints from the British about US policy in Afghanistan and about the US decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, with the British absurdly implying that Britain should have remained in Afghanistan and the United States should have remained in Afghanistan indefinitely, and the British actually floating publicly a cack-handed, indeed ludicrous idea of Britain leading an European force, presumably made up of France and Germany, to take the place of the United States in Afghanistan, a non-starter if ever there was one. All of these projects I've discussed in many programs. I've said how I thought they were utterly misconceived, how they all showed an utterly hopeless approach to foreign policy, a complete failure to assess and understand British capabilities and British interests. And I think that the nuclear power deal and AUKUS with Australia caps this sorry catalogue. What it looks to me happened was the following, and I am reconstructing now. I don't know the full details. It may be that I'm wrong in some particulars, but I am reasonably confident that I've got the full outline here. It seems to me that Johnson is very anxious to reinsert Britain as a big player in the Pacific. And as a result, he called and had discussions with Scott Morrison in Australia and pointed to the long-standing alliance and friendship between Britain and Australia, and he spoke to Scott Morrison about the way in which Australia was becoming increasingly exasperated about the inflated costs of the submarine deal with France, and he suggested to Scott Morrison that perhaps Britain would be a better country to supply nuclear submarines to Australia than France. But as Britain doesn't build conventionally powered submarines anymore, the only sort of submarines he could offer the Australians was nuclear submarines, submarines no doubt of the Astute class. The trouble is that those submarines use American nuclear technology. So that meant speaking to the United States, discussing this deal with the United States, and getting the Americans to greenlight it, to agree to this proposal by the British, for the British to sell nuclear submarines, or at least nuclear submarine technology, to Australia to replace the French submarine deal. And it looks to me as if Johnson discussed it directly with Biden at the G7 summit in Cornwall, and the British government, the British Foreign Office, some British officials have been discussing it with the Australians and the Americans over the last few months as well. And so I suspect this whole cack-handed, bizarre proposal originated in London in the circle around Johnson, and probably, almost certainly in fact, with Johnson himself. And here, I'm afraid, comes the real disaster, because Scott Morrison, who's clearly a leader far out of his depth, weakly went along with it. But the United States, which should know better, went along with it also. They green-lighted this arrangement between the British and the Australians, involving the sale by the British of nuclear submarines, or at least nuclear technology, and this proposal by the British to build infrastructure, nuclear submarine infrastructure in Australia. And that was how all these proposals, the AUKUS deal, the nuclear submarine deal, how all that came together. Because, as I have discussed many times, the foreign policy establishment in the United States, in Washington, is weak. It is led by amateurs, and they didn't understand the implications and the dangers of what Johnson was proposing, or the way it would cut against US interests and upset and antagonize US allies. So, blindly, following the siren calls from Johnson, they went along with a deal that Johnson wanted to spring as part of his desire to cut a big figure in world politics without thinking through fully the implications of what happened. And because Johnson's entire approach here was precisely to cut out the French, Johnson insisted on secrecy, and the Australians and the Americans weakly went along with his requests. And now, of course, it's all unraveled, because the Americans and the Australians are stunned and appalled by the French reaction, by the reaction of their other European allies, by the reaction of the Indians, and they are now busy, they're scrambling to repair the damage. And in the meantime, as a result, they've both become, especially the Americans, extremely annoyed with Johnson and with the British, and that reflects the cold reception he got from the Americans in New York, with the Americans refusing to celebrate the AUKUS deal and the nuclear submarine deal, and scrambling to conciliate the French, making major concessions to the French, and also refusing to agree to Johnson's urgent requests for a free trade deal with the United States, and bringing up to Johnson's obvious discomfort the whole suggestion and proposal of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I'm going to say this, the United States is not going to be happy if an EU army does develop, but probably, at least in the short term, they can live with it, even though from their perspective, it's clearly a threat, a long-term threat to NATO. The Americans might speak of the EU army as complementing NATO, but everybody knows that in the long term, it is intended to substitute for NATO. But in the short to medium term, they can probably live with this arrangement. The British, by contrast, will be horrified. For them, it will be the deepest strategic nightmare, marginalising Britain's role in Europe and creating that Franco-German military partnership that the British have always been incredibly uneasy about and have done everything they possibly can up to now to sabotage and to prevent it from becoming realised. And now, to British horror and distress, we have a statement from the Americans rather, that they are prepared, it seems, to greenlight the EU army idea that Macron is so busy promoting. So, this is a debacle. It is a debacle that has damaged the United States and which shows the weakness of US foreign policy under this administration and its inability to think things through properly and in an organised way, and its a folly in getting drawn along by somebody like Boris Johnson into policy decisions and actions which were certainly misconceived. But the big loser, ultimately, is Britain. Britain has seen its relations with the United States damaged. Its prospects of getting a free trade deal with the United States have been damaged further. And, of course, it has upset and annoyed the United States by interfering with US grand strategy in a way that causes real damage to US alliances. And beyond that, the British now have to face the very real possibility that some kind of project for a EU army might indeed, after all, get off the ground, though again, I still think that the prospects of that are limited and small. Now, I've made comments about Johnson's foreign policy many times, the fact that it is misconceived and reckless and that it is going to end badly for Britain. We've now seen how it can do actual damage. I think that somebody in London needs to take Johnson to one side and explain to him that he is not Winston Churchill, as he would like to be, and that Britain doesn't have the kind of global military and diplomatic power that it had when Churchill was Prime Minister. The concept of global Britain is not by any means in and of itself a bad one. But in my opinion, what global Britain has to mean if it is to succeed is a policy of positioning Britain as a country that talks to everyone, trades with everyone, does deals with everyone, and looks to maintain good relations with everyone. That includes talking to people like the Chinese and the Russians, obviously, though, of course, the NATO alliance and the United States alliance must be the overarching priority. But it is a foreign policy that should emphasise commerce, trade, Britain's enormous strengths in financial services, its global reach through the widespread use of English, its cultural attractiveness, and of course its immense commercial skills. Sending gunboats to the Black Sea, sending carriers to the Pacific, interfering with the grand strategy of the United States by inserting itself into a submarine deal with Australia that upsets and alarms the French and causes concern in capitals like Tokyo and New Delhi. All of that is a mistake. Conducting foreign policy in this secretive way and springing surprises on people without preparing them in advance makes it even worse. It makes it look like a school prank. If this continues for much longer, what we are going to find is that instead of Britain becoming a global player, nobody will want to deal with us at all. Now, on that sad note, I have to leave. I hope that much will be learnt from this episode. Real damage has been done, but I hope that the British still have the sense and the grasp to learn better and to do better next time. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You will find links under this video. And of course, don't forget also to check us out on our main platform, on our other platforms rather, especially Locals, where we have an active and vibrant community where you can post content if you wish, if you want to become an active member, as it is called, where you can see our videos uninterrupted by commercials, and where, by the way, we also are providing now a great deal of exclusive content touching on matters which we are unwilling to discuss on big tech platforms like YouTube. So come to Locals and join us there. Join us also, if you wish, in our other platforms, above all, the new free speech platforms, SuperU, but also BitChute, Library, Rumble, and Odyssey. And if you want to support us, you can support us through Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the amazing things that we have there, our famous magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And thank you again for joining me today. Please remember to press the like button if you've liked this video, and please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. And I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.